you. So if you have later after our presentation, our kind of Q&A and coffee chat, hopefully everyone has their coffee this morning. I have tea instead of coffee, but I'm a tea drinker, ex-Diet Coke drinker, so I had to give that up for tea. But so we will, after Doug and Juliet kind of chat and talk about Doug's work, we will have an opportunity for Q&A. There's two ways for us to do Q&A. One is in the chat button, which is also in your bottom bar there on Zoom. You can put a question in chat at any time, and I'll be moderating the chat. Or if you want to, under reactions, there's a raise your hand button. And at our Q&A, you're welcome to raise your hand. We will see that it's raised, and then we'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself and come on in and chat with us directly versus the virtual chat. All right, I'm just admitting a couple more people, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Miss Juliet Schultz, the Executive Director of the Women's Resource Center. I'm very proud and honored to work with the Women's Resource Center on doing marketing and communications and anything else I can help with. So I'm going to turn it over to Juliet. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I was reviewing the guest list again, and I thought, this is just a bunch of friends and board members, and I'm so glad that you're all here. I'm super psyched about Doug Fierberg and what he's about to share with you today. I want to start by saying yay to Higher Grounds for privately labeling this beautiful coffee, which does taste delicious. Although I try not to drink coffee on a regular basis, I had to break down and try this. So really nice simple blend. And the label, if you guys looked at the label at all, is Paulino Siciliano. He's a local artist. And he allowed us to use that painting. He's actually painted the one that's behind me. He's donated a number of paintings to the Women's Resource Center. So if you guys get a chance or you run into Paulino in town, make sure you say thank you to him because he's pretty genius with his art. So thank you to Higher Grounds, and thank you to the 7 board members that are here. Doug's also a member of our board and has been for quite some time. And I just appreciate Kat says she loves the coffee. Good. I'm glad it tastes good. Appreciate the support of the board and everybody being here. So I just want to give a little introduction of Doug. He is a civil and social activist. He's one of the fiercest survivor activists I've ever met. He leads a team of attorneys, and he's incredibly humble about his work. Very self-deprecating, funny guy. You may or may not get that out of today's discussion, but it's one of the reasons that he's so endearing and that I like him so much. What he does for me is he's always in my back pocket. He continues to take my call, thankfully. It'll be a sad day when he doesn't, but really, he's always been there to back up the Women's Resource Center on any type of legal matter, any type of contract negotiation. And sometimes we have to discuss with him survivor issues and get his opinion or get his attorney's opinion on those. So I'm really happy to have him here today. He was recently featured on 60 Minutes. So I think he's had a number of moments of, 15 minutes of fame. This is just one more in a long list of fame appearances or famous appearances for Doug. And I'm just really happy to have him here today. This will be a Q&A between he and I. I'll ask him questions and he'll answer those questions, and we'll kind of continue on. And then we'll leave enough time for questions at the very end of this discussion, if you might have them. The one thing I want to let you know about, and Doug put this in perspective for me, I'm giving you all a very, very big trigger warning right now. This is a tough topic to talk about. I understand if you want to leave early because it will get graphic. And what he said to me when he started to talk to me about this discussion was, this is a full trigger warning, Juliet. So I'm just letting you know, this is a full trigger warning from Doug Fierberg. This is not an easy conversation to have, but it's one that's really important. And so thank you. There's over 40 people here in the room today. I appreciate you all. Grateful that you're here. And I'm going to turn it over to Doug to do a little introduction of himself, but starting with telling us about how in the heck did you get into this work? What pointed you in the direction of this type of work that you're doing today and representing survivors?
All right, thanks. I'm not into narcissism. We've seen that for like the last 6 years on fire. So I'm going to try and keep the discussion a lot less about me than about the work. I'm not really comfortable about switching that focus, but in '85, I left the University of, well, I left Ann Arbor. I was out of school and went to Washington, D.C. to begin the practice of law. I was being trained as a trial attorney in commercial related issues. So all sorts of things involving businesses, contracts, local, national. And then somewhere around 93 or so, I picked up 2 cases at the same time. They were for young people. One was a young man that was seriously hazed at the University of Maryland. He was probably 20 when I began representing him. And then an 18-year-old young woman who had been set up by someone associated or close to the mayor of the District of Columbia to be gang raped in a park in Washington, D.C. And I think both of those situations sort of triggered something in me, that there were a lot of young people out there in extremely vulnerable positions, facing very large hurdles. And there was a space in there for pretty assertive, aggressive trial lawyering. So even for the young woman that I represented who was sexually assaulted at the age of 16, it showed me that there were issues of vulnerability, power, money, influence, archaic assumptions. And, candidly, then the representation by the young man's family was by the top attorneys in Washington, D.C., the one who represented John Hinckley Jr., who shot Reagan and had continued to represent Hinckley Jr. for 30 years. I came to understand if you sort of threw in on the victim's advocacy side or the survivor side, a real trial lawyer who didn't give a shit about who the other side was, that there was a good space to do some good work. So then sort of what developed out of that was a recognition that there were a lot of violence in schools where young people were, and there was no one in the country that specialized in that. And so I began specializing in that. And over the years, the practice has been national. I represented 20 families in the Virginia Tech massacre, other shooting tragedies around the country. And, by way of what's going on, I mean, even today, we've got a lawyer in New Orleans on behalf of a young woman sexually assaulted in high school at the Tony school that the Manning family, Eli Manning and those folks went to. We're going to be downstate for the drowning death of a 3-year-old. So that's how it all comes up. Give you an idea.
Doug, talk a little bit about the difference between acts of sexual violence and how they're handled in criminal versus civil litigation and the kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah, so most people know it from all sorts of sources that the criminal justice system doesn't often provide the types of legal remedies that people are looking for, either from, perhaps the hesitancy to have survivors report into the criminal justice system, or what then happens often in the criminal justice system where, or there's sort of archaic ideas about, well, this is just a he said, she said. And so given the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, there'll be no prosecution. Or, you've seen some of these sentencing issues like out in California, where the Stanford sexual assault case where, someone sexually assaulted a young woman and ultimately the sentence was inconsequential. So, in the US justice system, beyond like the criminal side of things, there's the civil justice system, which people most often think about in terms of, well, hey, you've got a lawsuit. I mean, you see if you turn on any television in this state, you see all the ads for, 1-800 call Sam. And that system isn't limited to just representing people who get hurt in auto accidents or slip on the pavement. That system can provide incredible remedies for survivors. So when you think about it, and at the very start, at the most basic level, the criminal justice system is a representation of the state against an alleged perpetrator, determining how the state is going to treat that perpetrator. The survivor in that circumstance is not the party to it. There's sort of, a secondary role often. They're not integrally involved sometimes in the decisions about what will be done, how it will be done, if it will be done, why it won't be done. And for a lot of survivors who've been involved in circumstances which involved, a massive power dynamic and a loss of power, this is a terrible cherry on the top, and can be. The difference in the civil justice system is that there's an element of control. Not the ultimate remedy may not be incarceration, but there are a lot of other remedies that are possible that involve someone standing up and taking control of the situation, perhaps, and how it ultimately resolves. Whether or not it resolves in many circumstances with financial recoveries, holding third parties responsible and causing change and reform in schools or reforms in institutions that may have not been acting properly, all sorts of different reforms. And so it baked into that civil system is also different avenues as well. So for example, for a young person who's sexually assaulted in a school, often that trauma almost always, that trauma adversely affects the educational process as part of their lives. And so, the law now provides under Title IX that schools have to do certain things to make sure that those educational opportunities are protected. Well, that's another space that survivors can be in order to take control over the affects of sexual assault. So those are the spaces that we're in, and they're incredibly meaningful to people. So, I mean, it can't be overstated, because for so many people, it is integral to the process of healing, whatever that means, for an individual person in an individual circumstance. It certainly means that at the end of the day, there was a serious element of power that they were able to obtain and make change. I'll give you just a brief graphic of something, okay? Just to give you one idea. This is a photograph, okay? I don't know if any of you can see it. If you can see it, the dark-skinned man in the blue shorts is a sheriff. The tall, thin, white guy is someone who sexually assaulted our client at the University of Virginia almost 2 years ago to the day, January 27th, 2 years ago. This is from last Saturday. That sheriff, this is in South Africa. That sheriff is serving that young man with a lawsuit filed in the Commonwealth of Virginia. As he's looking at those papers that the sheriff has, he's learning right then that he's going to be held to account for harm he did in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I don't know ultimately what the end result of this litigation will be. It's just started. But I can tell you that that singular photograph that's been seen by the survivor and the survivor's parents has been transformative. Just that. Because it's been 2 years that, and he's from an extremely wealthy family. He's been living his own life. You know, he's selling organic goods at some market in South Africa, having not borne any, well, he was kicked out of UVA, but having not borne any real consequences for what he did to the survivor. So that's the civil justice system. There's been no criminal prosecution in that matter. It just shows the space that can exist to help survivors that is in the civil justice system.
Doug, you talk a lot about the difference. You told us about the difference between civil and criminal, and the word that comes to my mind is empowerment.
Mhm.
Is how we connected initially, and empowering survivors. And I think it's really important to really reinforce that and make sure everybody understands that. So Doug's firm is empowering survivors, giving them their control and their power back after it was taken away from them. And I love the picture. I think it's a great example of what empowerment looks like. And it's not necessarily what we might think it looks like, you know, in day-to-day walking around world, but that's what empowerment looks like to a survivor of a sexual assault at the UVA. And one of the things that we know about Doug, being a member of the board, is that he does not stop. He will persist. Like he said, doesn't know where the case is going to go, but the fact that he and his attorneys are going to persist is what makes the difference. I'm curious, Doug, if you could talk to us. One of the conversations you and I have had is about language.
Mhm.
And we've talked about how language can be very harmful, and your colleagues' opportunities to be in a trial or in the judge's chambers or one-on-one with these attorneys who are representing people like the person you just pictured. And what is it? Talk to me a little bit about the language that's being used and your position on language as it relates to sexual violence.
All right, this is going to be like quick, down and dirty, because it's an extended topic. But let's start off with the idea that, you know, obviously we're in a male-dominated world, been that way, dawn of time. You know, one of my first law firms used to have like 2 or 3 women lawyers, and they had children, and then they came back, but they were still working full time, but being paid 3/4 time. So there's so much baked into our world that is misogynistic on some level, or has got archaic assumptions and things like that. Typically, when you're involved in civil litigation, look, the defense bar, the group of lawyers that are typically defending cases like this are 65-year-old white males with thick-soled black shoes, and they drive really nice cars, and they've got comfortable environments. They belong to country clubs. Their life is perfectly comfortable. The world is as they know it, and as has been very advantageous to them. Part of what comes in that world, though, is there's this issue of what language is used, and are we really being honest about what happened? Can we articulate this in a way that doesn't reflect perhaps older ways of approaching these issues, which are not honest? So, for example, you know, when we describe a lot of when acts of sexual violence are often described in newspapers, there's a number of ways that those descriptions are just not accurate as to what happened. Either they're in a passive form, or they're in a form that suggests some form of consensual sex involved. So I'll give you an example, or a couple examples. You know, after there was drinking, then she was raped. Well, that's a pretty passive way of describing that circumstance. Or then there was intercourse, or he engaged in intercourse with her. No, I mean, the concept of intercourse is fairly broad, but it's not rape, you know, and it's a much more accurate way of describing what happened to say they were drinking and then he raped her, or and then he penetrated her with his penis. That's accurate. The other descriptions don't really convey the violence that's involved. They don't convey the harm that's involved. They don't convey the power dynamic that's involved. And they're just wrong. And so, for example, and look, or another expression that you see a lot in newspapers and media generally, you know, and then they're going to prosecute her rapist. What? I mean, do you get ownership and possession and control? Is this your rapist? I mean, did you bargain for that? Why, you know, it's not her rapist. It's the man who raped her. That's accurate language. And, you know, that's a struggle often in the law in a lot of different forums. So I was involved, Juliet says something in mediations and things. I was representing a young woman who was sexually assaulted in a fraternity house at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And she was sexually assaulted on a couch in a common area while there was a party that was raging on. And cases defended by 3 or 4 of the top, you know, defense lawyers in Connecticut. And baked into this premise was this idea on their side that, you know, maybe there's some consensuality in this and everything else. And, you know, in the mediation in the judge's chambers, you know, I confronted him and said, look into your lives. Do you know a woman that in anywhere, you guys are 65 years old, that is going to get fucked in the common area as a freshman in college by some guy on a couch? And the judge interrupted me. Mr. Fierberg, that's language we don't use in my chambers. Really? I mean, Judge, you have a job to do. I get it. You have a job to do. And so do I. And my job is to be honest about certain circumstances and to use the language that's accurate. I'm not going to say that's going to have intercourse. This wasn't that. This wasn't consensual. So I hear what your rules are. I get it. But I'm an advocate and I'm not going to be short with my language or anything other than that. And, you know, she was like, damn, you know, but, you know, no backing down. It's not a reality. Which I could dovetail into the conversation about Blasey Ford's representation in the Kavanaugh hearings, which I thought was horrible. But that's another conversation if anybody wants to contact me privately about that. I mean, I guess the point is that language is important. It's language that we use at the outset of the lawsuit, at the outset of our discussions, because if only you're communicating to the defense world that you're unwilling as an advocate for your client to talk in quasi honest terms, that's making some change, whatever that change may be, but it's making change by ensuring that at least we're going to discuss these situations honestly.
So Doug, what you're saying is, you know, for all of us who are out in the world walking around, when we're reading articles that say things like her rapist, or that use language like he engaged in sexual relations with her,
Absolutely,
had been drinking or whatever, that this is an opportunity for us to advocate in a way that feels comfortable to us. For example, if we see that and we're motivated to write a letter to the editor and say, by the way, just want to let you know, this is the proper language to use. She was raped by him. This was not consensual. And so I think what you're saying is so important, because it's not just learning about it, but it's taking it out into the world and advocating and truly doing what it is that we feel we can on behalf of survivors in our small region. And there are a lot of them. So I thank you for those specific examples.
Let me give you one more example.
Yep, go for it.
She was raped, but delayed reporting to the police for 2 weeks. Is everybody comfortable with that statement? Delayed reporting for 2 weeks, delayed reporting for 30 days. I mean, baked into that singular world is this idea that there's some normative standard, some baseline that must assume that normal behavior is sexual assault, police within what, a 2-hour period, a 5-hour period, a 10-hour period. Someone tell me what the standard is such that the use of the word delayed doesn't have adverse implications to it, suggesting that maybe it wasn't quite true. Because if it was true, she wouldn't have delayed reporting to the police. And so those are certain assumptions that are baked into the language that we typically use that need to be challenged. And we certainly challenge it in our representation.
And, you know, Doug, as advocates, what we know is that it can take a long time for a survivor to come forward. You know this, you've been on cases where it's taken a long time. Every survivor's experience is different. And I just thank you for making that clarification, because I think as we're taking in information and the media channels that we're taking in, about what you're reading, think about what you're digesting as you're having conversations with people who really don't want to talk about this topic, which is why I'm so glad we're here today. Think about how you can interject and intervene and educate others about this type of language that is, in my opinion, very victim blaming and shaming. And that's talked about a lot in the media today, but Doug, I want to ask you a little bit about myths and debunking those myths and some of the shaming that goes on, and some of the specifics that you can share about that.
Well, yeah, there's a body of law that talks about archaic myths involving sexual violence, men, women. It's more so was used in the Title IX context to sort of smash the differing educational and sport opportunities that existed in the, all the way up into the 80s and 90s, and still today, actually. So I don't mean to denigrate it. It's fewer and far between in athletics. So, when I was an all-state wrestler, we had a wrestling team, which was attended by 4 people over the entire year. 2 who were probably pedophiles. There were 2 sports for women, one of which was probably identified as cheerleading. So, that system was based upon archaic assumptions about how men could handle certain athletics and women couldn't, and things like that. Those archaic assumptions still sort of flow through a lot of the dialogue that exists in sexual violence even now. So in a lot of circumstances, people feel like they're required to say the alleged rapist. Well, That's often because there's this presumption of innocence that we have in our criminal justice system. But we know so few of the criminal cases actually end up being fully litigated and going to conclusion. It's such a small percentage, so we're using words that are very different to ultimately how it all is going to work out. That's just one example. So, there are other examples in terms of, like, when I said delaying in reporting, when I also talk in certain cases about, did she fight back? Did she scream? Again, assumptions, I could say probably male developed, as to what a sexual assault is supposed to look like and what a survivor's response is supposed to look like. Was she texting people? Did she ask for help? Did she reach out? Did she, in a common area, I mean, this goes back to one of the examples that I gave you, did she in a common area scream? There were people there. Lots of people should have, would have, if it was in fact not consensual. So lots of those things are also baked into the system that are part of the battlegrounds in individual cases and then ultimately within the civil justice system.
And Doug, how are you seeing some of this over the course of your very long career? How are you seeing some of this shift? What's shifting from a civil litigation standpoint for survivors of sexual violence? What's changing in the landscape? Are you seeing some of this language shift from where it was previously, 10, 15, 20 years ago, with the awareness that people have about sexual assault now, with the attention that domestic and sexual violence is getting in the media? What are you seeing shift, and how are you seeing that shift from a civil litigation standpoint from all aspects?
So, I mean, you could look at the Kavanaugh hearings and go, nothing's changing. Your head could explode from that. But that's a singular example, very public, but a good example of where there isn't change. We see change fairly regularly. Court to court, state to state, small victories. I mean, we just resolved last week, Monday, maybe, a case on behalf of a 16-year-old at the time of the sexual assault. She's now 22, 6 years, in Georgia, in a public school district there. That's going to have more, part of the resolution is going to be more training in that school district on Title IX and victim blaming issues and retaliation against students that report being sexually assaulted. So these are victories that are going on outside of, like, the major spotlights of, the tectonic shit show that you may see in front of Congress. And I would also say what a lot of people don't see on a daily basis is that some of the representation on behalf of survivors around the country is getting much better. In 15, 20 years ago, people would be like Gloria Allred out of California. And, we can debate whether or not she's good and only settles cases and all that sort of stuff. We can get into that later. But, Gloria Allred was out there, maybe one or two other folks. There's a lot of serious lawyers that are out there in this space. And that's good, because a lot of mistakes are being corrected. Lots of things are changing. You've seen, Baylor being held responsible. Look, you just saw the University of Michigan resolution of $400 and some odd million. Open disclosure, I was sexually assaulted by that doctor, so I'm part of that litigation. When I wrestled for University of Michigan briefly. But you're seeing, look, you can take a look what happened with USA Gymnastics. Things are happening that are moving this ball forward, but there's a lot of history that's in the way and that still needs to be corrected.
I have to close this before we open the Q&A, Doug, by asking you the question that I think everybody wants to know is, and maybe it's a very expected answer, why are you doing this?
Because golf sucks.
True.
You know, there are meaningful ways to help people. This isn't about me. There's the ways that the law can actually work, that isn't just shuffling money. Now, believe me, I still shuffle money. I still represent a lot of businesses, because I've been trained as a trial lawyer, and I can see the chessboard to the end. And I can see which pieces are going to matter and which pieces aren't going to matter. So I've had businesses that have had me for a long, long time. I mean, I just did a business trial in Traverse City for a local business, and beat Mr. Big Pants from Traverse City. But this type of work is really the central focus of how this firm is developed. And I think if you look at the way I've developed the firm, it doesn't look like any other Traverse-based firm. First of all, we don't have any signs that, that we're not advertising locally, but you take a look at the lineup, and the lineup is, really smart, predominantly women, Harvard, NYU, Columbia, really passionate, really smart. And there's sort of the way it should be. I mean, I don't want to make it personal. It's very important work to me. But the work isn't about me. That's narcissism times 2. So this is what we do. We're really passionate about it. It gives its own rewards to others. And it's incredibly interesting, if only because if you think about it, look, you could be in the practice of law, and the law gives like awards to lawyers all the time. They call lawyers the lions of the law. What? Doing auto accident cases, slip and falls, things like that. I mean, some of that's painting by numbers. And that's not to say that the car accident person doesn't need a really good lawyer. They do. They should get one. Perhaps one better than 1-800-CALL-SAM. Okay. But, there's something in there that when you're making real differences in people's lives in these sorts of areas, where it's perhaps for a young survivor, their first encounter with the legal system, and all of a sudden they're in big person world, and you can stand between that and the big person world and get justice for them. I was representing the 16-year-old. She showed up at DC Superior Court. There were 5 motions to dismiss the case because the rich family got the kid out of the country. Okay. And they had the top trial lawyer, one of the top trial lawyers in the District of Columbia, who was, an asshole. Right. She showed up in court in the District of Columbia in a white ski jacket with blonde hair. She had no clue about image issues or anything else. And standing between that load and her was me at the time. And some of that's really meaningful when you can do that for somebody else. So that's where we're passionate, we're focused.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to open it up. I know we have one question in the chat. I'm going to let Sarah take that over. I want to open it up for any questions for Doug at this point.
Good. Thank you. So a couple ways for people to ask questions. Again, if you want to put it in the chat over in the bottom, and it will pop up on your right-hand side of the screen. For most of you, if you're on a computer, it might be a little bit different if you're on an iPad or a smaller device. You also can raise your hand either visually, so I can see you on camera, or if you want to use the reaction button at the bottom and raise your hand, and then we can have you come off mute. But I think this, Brooke is asking this question, Doug, and I also haven't had an opportunity to watch the 60 Minutes interview, but if we missed it, can you give us why they had reached out to you, and what did you get the honor to talk about on that?
Well, so I represent a lot of
show?
families whose children have been hurt or killed in fraternity system, the fraternities on college campuses. They exist on most college campuses across the country. And this family's son died in a hazing incident in the state of Washington. And they were profiled, and then I was asked to talk a little bit about the fraternity industry in general. What most people don't know is that incidents of sexual violence at universities and severe injury and death exist in great numbers within the Greek system, particularly fraternities. Women, the sororities are a little different, though I'm doing a sorority death case out in California right now. But we've been trying to smash that system in some level so that students who are in college get accurate, timely information about the risks they face involving sexual violence and death on campus, because so much of those incidents are within fraternity houses. Because in order to sexually assault somebody, for example, you need to disable them. You need to have some sort of control and space where there's not qualified adult supervision or security. And fraternity houses are a primary place where women are sexually assaulted. So I was talking about the fraternity industry and why it's an industry, and it's not just that little local chapter house that everybody thinks is, Animal House, but it is, it's part of a large industry that's on college campuses across the country, earning millions of dollars. So is that.
Great.
Anyway.
Bonnie Alfonso has her hand raised, so I'm going to have her come off mute. Thank you.
So speaking of lots of money and power and justice, in our own backyard, Lee Chatfield, and the level of looking the other way of his behavior that was well known by the legislature, as well as the amount of money that was funneled into his coffers and caucuses. I hope you're involved in that case, and darn it. But what do you see as some of the potential outcomes that could help change all that led to this?
I'll have this conversation with you afterwards, because and I hate to say it this way, there's so much injury and death around. Like, for example, I was quoted in the Free Press on the Oxford shooting. I have not yet focused on the legal issues of that. And so when you say to me, Lee Chatfield, I don't know enough about like the dynamic and the fact pattern and what might be implicated, because candidly, I just don't have the bandwidth to connect to so many of these different things, given what we've got going on. But if I knew more about it and we talked more about it, I could absolutely give you my take on it. So I'm not pushing your question away. I'm saying I'm happy to answer it, but I need to know more. I'll need to know more.
Thank you, Doug.
And I'm sorry. There's a lot that I don't know about because someone hasn't retained us to completely strip through everything to figure out what the strategy is. We're doing that right now on two cases: the death of a young man in Virginia, and we're doing it on the sexual assault of a mother of 5 by a gynecologist in Illinois. So that's the deep dive right now. I don't know enough about the Lee Chatfield situation to answer it, but I'm happy to do it.
Thank you, Doug. Anyone else with questions or comments for Doug as we wrap up? I want to say this, Doug is just a perfect example of the intelligent, motivated activists that we have on our board. So lucky to have such an amazing board. There's 7 of them here today, and he is a perfect example of the type of people that we have leading our organization. So I'm just so grateful Thank you,
incredible.
Doug. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else before we leave today? I just am so appreciative of your time.
I did want to say, listen, for anybody who's more interested in the topic of like language, I posted on the blog and our website. There's this article. You'll see it on the blog section by two really smart women. One former sergeant, I think she's retired from the San Diego Police Department, and PhD director of research for IBAWI, that talks about certain examples of language and what should or shouldn't be used, and some of these distinctions that I stole from when I was talking to you. Okay.
I will put your website in the chat. If anyone wants to click on that link, it'll take you to Doug's website. But we'll also be following up. You'll be getting an email from Jamie Bell from the Women's Resource Center with a follow-up to this call and with some other resources in regards to what Doug referenced in the language. So I'm going to turn it back over to Juliet to wrap us up today. Thank you.
All right, we are good to go. Everybody have a great day. There is a final comment. I want to just include this from Jennifer Tang Anderson regarding Lee Chatfield. If he's charged with a crime, he is innocent until proven guilty in court, as is every criminal defendant. Innocent doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means that the proofs have not been presented yet. Thank you for a great presentation. Thank you, Jennifer, for that comment. All right, everybody, we're good. Thank you so much for being a part of our very first virtual presentation. Thank you, Doug Fierberg. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.